Hello and welcome to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 5 Countdown video. Today our analysts will be listing the top 5 compositions for patch 11.7. Most of the meta shifts we're seeing stem from the 11.6b patch, as 11.7 for the most part didn't have many relevant meta changes in it. This does mean the top compositions haven't changed all that much, so expect to see a lot of similar faces. With all that said, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off our top 5, we have Kayle coming in as the number 5 comp. Even though the meta hasn't shifted all that much for the past few patches, we have begun to see the decline of Kayle. Part of this is due to the nerf she received during the 11.6b patch, but also due to the meta favoring compositions that spike earlier than Kayle does. Those power spikes lead to Kayle players being punished until they're able to get Kayle 2 and the rest of their board online. Of course, it's worth noting that Kayle is plenty strong in the late game with a full comp backing her and good items. She's especially good against any clumped up builds like Keeper, though that matchup is all about who positions better. But against Mage, Slayer, and even Fabled, Kayle can struggle to deal enough damage before being run over. It also hasn't helped that quite a few key pieces for Kayle builds are being contested. Adept units are being used by a wide variety of compositions, and Xayah is being snatched up by Keeper players. Lee Sin is being contested a lot even without using his traits due to his ability. Combine all of these factors and you have Kayle compositions struggling in the meta. Despite that, Kayle builds are still more consistent than other builds that may have taken the number 5 spot. Let's move on to our next composition, which comes in at number 4, Fabled. Fabled slides back into the top 5 after Neeko received a buff to her damage in the 11.6b patch. Vanguard was also buffed in 11.7, but since it was only to 8 Vanguard, it really hasn't been all that relevant. Fabled Vanguard Mystic was already on the cusp of the meta for the last few patches, so having Neeko be a more consistent damage dealer has helped push it towards the top. There's quite a few reasons as to why Fabled does well in the meta. The first aspect is that it's easy to play. The composition consists of 3 Fabled units, Vanguards for frontline, and Mystic to round it out. That simplicity helps a lot, as getting the composition rolling is much easier than players that are pivoting from build to build. With Neeko as the main carry, the composition spikes earlier than builds relying on 4-cost units, so it's common to get a nice mid-game advantage when running Fabled. Another reason for Fable doing so well is how inherently defensive it is against the majority of builds. 6 Vanguard, for example, is easy to pivot into for this composition, and that will slow down several meta carries like Olaf, Sivir, and Talon. Or if the lobby you're in happens to lean more towards magic damage, you can focus more on Mystic. Overall, being able to tailor your board to counter the lobby is a huge boon for Fabled. Of course, there are a few downsides to Fabled as well. The largest issue is that you really want Sejuani and Aatrox as part of your frontline for their crowd control, but both units are hard to 2-star since they get contested quite often. Ornn is also important, but being a 5-cost unit, it can be difficult to roll for him consistently. Another issue, albeit minor, is that the win condition for the build relies on hitting Neeko 3. Neeko 3 is definitely doable in any game you play Fabled, but relying on a 3-star unit can cause some issues, especially if multiple players end up contesting the build. But again, this is a minor issue. All in all, the strengths of Fabled Vanguard Mystic outweigh the weaknesses in the current meta. Let's now move on to the number 3 composition, Keeper. Keeper is sort of the gatekeeper between the top end of the meta and the rest. It's a composition that can go toe-to-toe with the likes of Slayer and Mage, but doesn't always come out on top. Against most other builds, though, Keeper will do well against them consistently. The main reason for that is how survivable the units are. It is inherently defensive thanks to the Keeper's shields, but Xayah is also quite difficult to kill because of her ultimate, and Kennen almost always has a Guardian Angel, so he survives long enough as well. Because the Keeper board has a strong defense, it naturally leads to longer team fights. By the end of the fight, you're often left with a few units versus a Xayah, and with proper items, Xayah generally wins because of her ultimate. Another important part of Keeper is how early it comes online. Compared to, say, Kayle, what you need for Keeper board is at least 4 Keepers, Kennen, and maybe Xayah 1 to begin winning rounds during the mid-game. Kayle, on the other hand, needs Kayle 2 and the right synergies to begin winning. Having a strong mid-game is important in the current meta, which favors Keeper compositions a lot. But as we mentioned, Keeper can struggle against Slayer and Mage. Mainly this is due to positioning, because to gain the full benefit of the Keeper trait, you need to clump up. This leaves your board weak to AoE, which both Mage and Slayers do a lot of. Plus, shields don't have any damage reduction the way armor and magic resist do, so your units can be killed much quicker to AoE than, say, a Fabled Vanguard Mystic comp. Overall, if you're looking for a solid mid-game composition that transitions well into the late game, then we recommend trying out Keeper. Up next, we have Slayer coming in as the number 2 composition. Whoa, Slayers aren't the number 1 composition? We know, it sounds like blasphemy, but it's actually true. Don't take this placement the wrong way though, as Slayer builds still dominate the meta due to their flexibility. With 3 possible carries that you can mix together, it means pivoting into Slayer is extremely easy to do. And if you're unable to secure an Olaf or Tryndamere in the late game, having a Samira 2 is essentially a guaranteed top 4. So why then do we have Slayer being placed only in second? Well, mostly because it can struggle to get its carries rolling early enough in the game. Yes, you have 3 potential carries, but for all of them to do well, you need items for them and they should be 2-starred. Without that, they can struggle to do enough damage. Olaf in particular is struggling right now because he takes time to ramp up in a fight, which can prove fatal against builds like Mage, where 1 Aurelion Soul can ultimate and end a fight. Setting aside the issues with Slayer, we still want it made clear that the synergy is insanely good. The flexibility it provides cannot be stated enough, so whenever you're in a game and unsure of what to play, chances are you can transition towards a Slayer comp and still place well at the end of the game. And with that, we move on to our number 1 composition for patch 11.7, Mages. Mages secure the number 1 spot because golly does Aurelion Soul do so much damage. That could be all we say in regards to mages, and honestly that would sum it up quite nicely. But let's explore the composition a bit more. When talking about mages, there's several variations, but by far the one doing the best is 7 Mage. This is because hitting 7 Mage is actually quite easy to play as long as you have at least 1 Aurelion Soul. Having a chosen mage isn't hard to find considering how many mages there are. Plus, it's common to see an early chosen mage run during the mid-game like Brand or Twisted Fate. Another reason is that the 7 mage trait adds a lot of extra damage. Naturally, this means all of your units are doing more damage, but importantly, it means you can skate by with an Aurelion Soul 1 for quite a while. Most of the mid and late game compositions don't really have that luxury, at least for builds that rely on a 4-cost carry. Slayer, for example, needs Olaf 2 or Tryndamere 2 to stabilize. Mage, on the other hand, stabilizes as soon as you hit Aurelion Soul, assuming that you have items for him. Stabilizing early means you can play greedier by leveling to 8 with a strong economy. From there, you'll have plenty of time to roll for Aurelion Soul 2, as well as find important units like Swain. You can also pivot out of 7 Mage if you hit other units like Olaf for Dragon Soul Slayer or Samira for Slayer. One last aspect about Mage is that it's by far the best composition to use a spatula item on. Turning Elise, Shyvana, or Swain into a Mage will boost your frontline so much as the Mage double cast causes them to gain extra health when they transform. Due to that, it makes Mages one of the strongest late game builds if you have a Swain 2 with a Mage hat. Overall, Mage may not be as flexible as Slayer since you do need Aurelion Soul, but it makes up for it by being less reliant on 2-starring Aurelion since he deals so much damage with the Mage trait. That wraps up our top 5 compositions for patch 11.7. But before we go, you already know we have a few honorable mentions to cover. Let's preface this by saying there's a lot of viable builds in the meta. Unfortunately, there's too many for us to cover, so we're focusing on just 3 for today, but there's plenty of other comps worth exploring. Up first for our honorable mentions, we have Sharpshooter Spirit. This is a composition that did really well a few patches ago when Tristana 3 was a monster until she got nerfed. The modern version of this build can still use Tristana 3 as the carry since she's received a few buffs since those nerfs, but the more common carry tends to be Sivir. Either way, whichever carry you go for, the core of the composition uses 4 Spirit and 4 Sharpshooter. This build spikes during the early and mid game since the board does a lot of damage before most players secure a solid front line. It can struggle towards the late game as it lacks a front line and does require a Sivir 3. That said, if you can hit a Sivir 3 early enough in the game, you should be able to survive long enough for a top 4 placement thanks to saving health during the earlier stages of the game. All in all, it's a strong contender in the meta, but lacks enough consistency to warrant a spot in our top 5. Next up, we have Talon. Talon has 2 potential builds he's used in. The first and most common is Enlightened Siphoner, which uses Talon and Morgana as the 2 carries. Whichever way you mix and match the rest of the composition, the goal is to end with 4 Siphoner. This allows you to skip defensive items on Talon so you can maximize his damage dealt. The other build you may see Talon used in is Spirit Assassin. In this build, he's not always the primary carry, but since the build does use 6 Assassin, the chances are he's going to be one of the highest damage dealers. This is a relatively niche composition, but it has become popular enough in the meta that it's worth highlighting. All in all, Talon has been receiving buff after buff, so he's a capable carry in the meta, though he can struggle against compositions that are clumped up, as well as boards with a lot of crowd control. And our last honorable mention we want to talk about today is Brawler. Specifically 8 Brawler, as this is the most common variation of the build. There's not a whole lot we need to say about this composition, as its simplicity is why it's strong in the meta. It can struggle towards the late game as Shyvana does get outscaled and set can be unreliable, but during the early game and especially the mid game, the build can dominate. That's going to be it for today's video, folks. Despite the last few patches being small, we're still seeing the meta evolve week to week. That said, we're seeing a lot of the same compositions do well, which is great for keeping the meta stable and balanced. Let us know in the comment section below what compositions you've been climbing with, if there's any we missed in our top 5. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.